Bonjour à tous. Hi everyone. Je m'appelle Catherine Lévesque. Je suis votre modératrice pour aujourd'hui. On s'excuse pour les légers délais de la conférence de presse. Il y a eu quelques problèmes techniques. Donc, nous avons une conférence de presse de Statistique Canada aujourd'hui qui va parler des données du recensement 2021 sur les familles, l'expérience militaire et les revenus. So today's press conference is from Statistics Canada to present the 2021 census data on families, military experience and income. Donc, on a trois personnes qui vont nous parler virtuellement aujourd'hui. D'abord, Laurent Martel, qui va parler pour le volet famille, Tristan Cayn, qui va parler d'expérience militaire, et André Bernard, qui va parler du volet revenu. Donc, je vous cède la parole. Ensuite, on va passer à la période de questions sur Zoom. C'est à vous.
Merci. Good morning. I am Laurent Martel, the Director of Demography at Statistics Canada. I'm grateful to be joining you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe First Nation, who were the first people to walk the lands on which the nation's capital is located today. This morning, Statistics Canada released the third set of the results from the 2021 census.
Testing system. 4 1 2 8 5 5 1 4 8 3 is not available. At the tone, please record.
Okay, there was a technical issue, but I think it's been resolved. Thank you. So I'll just repeat my last sentence to introduce the fact that Statistics Canada is releasing this morning the third set of results from the 2021 census through its official release bulletin, The Daily. Donc, je remercie d'abord sincèrement tous les Canadiens d'avoir répondu au recensement de 2021. We know that this information presented here today will help inform the development of sound public policy across the country and for all communities. With new, modernized tools and platforms, we are showcasing our data in more innovative ways, including our new StatCan app. Cette diffusion présentera un portrait des familles et des ménages au Canada, de l'expérience militaire canadienne, ainsi que le profil de revenus de la population. I will start by presenting highlights on families and households for today's release. My colleague Tristan Cayn, Chief of Diversity and Sociocultural Statistics, will showcase military experience data, followed by André Bernard, Chief of Income and Socioeconomic Wellbeing Statistics. He will provide an overview of the income data. Cette présentation se fera dans les deux langues officielles et vous êtes invité à poser des questions, bien entendu, dans la langue de votre choix. So a number of census products are available today are made available today by Statistics Canada. They're free, of course, on Statistics Canada website. Key findings and stories can be found in 4 analytical documents released through the Daily. First one focuses on the living arrangements of Canadians. Another one is focusing on couples diversity, a third one on income, and the last one on the Canadian military experience. Included in those 4 documents are interesting charts, maps, and of course, international comparisons. On Statistics Canada website, you will also find many data products, including the census data tables, several visualization tools allowing you to easily and quickly get their census counts for any community of this country. Also available, of course, are a number of reference products if you need information on definitions and concepts. So let's now begin our journey through the results on living arrangements of Canadians. So in 2016, one-person households become the most prevalent household type for the first time in Canada's 150-year history. One-person households continued to hold the top spot among households in 2021, representing about 3 households in 10. While one-person households have been rising steadily in Canada over time, from an international perspective, These households are more prevalent in several other countries than in Canada, and in particular in the Nordic countries, where about 4 in 10 households are composed of one person. Among G7 countries, only the United States have a slightly smaller share of one-person households than Canada. The continued rise in one-person household is mostly explained by the aging of the population. Even though proportionally fewer older adults live alone today than did previous generations, living alone is still the most prevalent type of households among older people, and proportionally more Canadians are now aged 65 and over. That said, cultural preferences also play a role in the prevalence of living solo. For example, Japan has the oldest population in the world, but not the highest share of one-person household. Along with living alone, there's been a steady increase over time in the share of households in which there is only one census family without any additional persons. As a reminder, a census family is either a couple family with or without children, or a lone parent family. Instead, other types of family households, including multiple generations of a family, 2 or more census families living together, or one census family living with additional relatives or non-related persons, have grown relatively rapidly over the last 20 years, and now close to and they represent now close to 1 million households, and that is 7% of all households in 2021. This is a clear indication that the growing diversity of families and households in Canada. Households composed of roommates, meaning 2 or more people living together, among which none are part of a census family, are the fastest growing household type in the last 5 years in this country. From 2016 to 2021, the number of roommate households increased by 14%, more than triple the growth of households with one census family with no additional people. While often considered a relatively new trend, the phenomenon of young adults living with their parents has been a topic of interest examined by Statistics Canada for nearly a century. From 2001 to 2016, the share of young adults living with their parents increased steadily. Over the period 2016 to 2021, there was a leveling off in the share of young adults aged 20 to 34 living in the same household of at least one parent, representing the living situation of 1 in 3. That's about 35% of young adults. The age profile of young adults who live with their parents has continued to shift to older ages. In 2021, close to 1 in 2 young adults who live with their parents were aged 25 to 34, compared to less than 2 in 5 20 years earlier, that is in 2001. Now, young adults may live with their parents out of necessity, preferences, or both. While some young adults may have always remained in their parents' home, others may have returned after 1 or more periods living elsewhere, including during the pursuit of studies or while living with a spouse or a partner, among other possibilities. There are large variations in the share of young adults living with their parents. The higher shares are observed in large urban centers such as Oshawa, Toronto, Windsor, and Hamilton, all located in Ontario. Between 2016 and 2021, the percentage of young adults living with their parents increased the most in large urban centers of Alberta and Saskatchewan, even if overall the share there is lower than in Ontario's large urban centers. Now, the census is a powerful tool to explore the living arrangements of many groups of the population according to different characteristics. The data released today, for example, allows us to look at the specific living arrangements of children 14 and under. They showed a pretty stable situation compared to 2016, with the majority of these children, that's about 70%, living with their two biological or adoptive parents. About 1 in 10 were living in step families, and close to 1 in 5, that's 19%, were part of a one-parent family. The remaining children either lived in a skipped generation family with a grandparent or grandparents and without parents, with other relative, or were foster children. One change we observe is the increasing proportion of young children living as part of one-parent families that live with their father. The share went from 14% in 1981 to 21% in 2021. Over 500,000 children aged 14 and younger, it's about 1 in 10, live with at least one grandparent in 2021, mostly in a multi-generational household, including at least one parent. That was a snapshot of key trends in terms of living arrangements in Canada. Next, we'll turn to what is new with families. So in 2021, over 8 in 10 families were couples, either married or common law, with or without children at home. The remaining 16% were one-parent families, and this share remained stable for the last decade. Among couple families, an equal share were families with or without children at home. The share of couple families without children has increased over the last few censuses, partly due to population aging. About 5% of all families in Canada were step families, meaning there was at least one child who was the biological or adopted child of only one spouse or partner in the couple. This proportion has been stable since step families were first measured in the census, that was in 2011. Let's now move to key findings related to the diversity of couples. In 2021, most adults had a spouse or partner, and that's been the case for the last 100 years. Indeed, the share of adults who are in a union has been remarkably stable through the last 100 years, representing the situation of about 6 in 10 adults, both in 2021 and a century earlier in 1921. Variations in the share of adults in couples over the last century reflect social changes. For instance, from the 1950s to the late 1970s, a surge of marriages and the baby boom at that time occurred as adults married and had children at historically young age. In turn, 2/3 of adults were in couples in 1961, the peak share over the last century. I'll now switch to French. Un élément qui a changé de façon importante au cours des derniers 50 ans est le nombre et la proportion de couples qui vivent en union libre. Alors, au cours de ces 50 dernières années, le nombre de couples vivant en union libre s'est multiplié par plus de 5, soit une croissance nettement supérieure à celle des couples mariés. Alors, à l'échelle nationale, le mariage demeure le plus fréquent parmi les unions, bien sûr, avec plus des 3/4 des couples mariés en 2021 et près du quart, donc, vivant en union libre. Une exception existe toutefois, le Nunavut, qui voit pour la première fois une majorité de couples qui vivent en union libre. Le Québec se distingue également avec plus de 2 couples sur 5 qui vivent en union libre dans cette province. Les territoires du Nord-Ouest ne sont pas très loin derrière, avec 36% des couples vivant en union libre. Alors, fait intéressant, le Canada est le premier parmi les pays du G7 quant à la prévalence de l'union libre en 2021. Surtout, en fait, en raison de la situation au Québec. Si on excluait le Québec de la moyenne nationale, le Canada présenterait une proportion de couples en union libre de 17 % au lieu de 23 %. Alors, autre fait très intéressant, la prévalence élevée des unions libres au Nunavut, au Québec et dans les territoires du Nord-Ouest place ces trois provinces et territoires devant la Suède, qui est le pays dans le monde avec la prévalence la plus élevée de l'union libre à 33 %, soit un couple sur trois en Suède qui vit en union libre. Alors, un autre changement mesuré au recensement est la part des couples avec enfants, qui est passé de 64 % en 1981 à 50 % en 2021, donc une diminution. Deux principaux facteurs sont à l'origine de la baisse progressive des couples avec enfants au Canada. D'une part, le vieillissement de la population, ainsi que la baisse de la fécondité depuis quelques années déjà. C'est aussi un autre signe que les familles composées de couples avec enfants, qui sont encore une forme de famille importante, mais que progressivement, d'autres types de familles deviennent aussi importantes et considérables en nombre, comme par exemple les couples sans enfants. Alors, la réalité de nombreuses personnes, notamment des enfants, est aujourd'hui plus diversifiée qu'avant. Parmi les familles composées de couples avec enfants, un peu plus d'une sur 10, une proportion de 12 % en 2021, était en fait une famille recomposée, c'est-à-dire une famille incluant au moins un enfant biologique ou adopté issu d'une union précédente. Cette proportion est demeurée assez stable depuis la première mesure de ces familles recomposées lors du recensement de 2011. Je vais terminer mon intervention ce matin en vous informant que le recensement de 2021 ajoutait une précision à sa question sur le sexe. On demandait le sexe à la naissance. Et le recensement incluait une nouvelle question sur le genre. Donc, le recensement de 2021 a permis de mesurer pour la toute première fois les couples selon la diversité de genre. Ainsi, on a pu distinguer les couples cisgenres, soit les couples où le sexe à la naissance et le genre sont les mêmes, des couples où au moins une personne est soit transgenre, soit non-binaire. Parmi les couples cisgenres, on peut continuer de distinguer les couples de même genre et les couples de genre différents. Les résultats indiquent que 98,5 % des 8,6 millions de couples vivant au Canada sont en fait des couples cisgenres de genres différents, autrement dit, qui incluent un homme et une femme, tous deux étant cisgenres. Le 1,5 % des couples restants, cela représente environ 128 000 couples au Canada, sont des couples cisgenres de même genre, des couples transgenres ou des couples non-binaires. La majorité parmi ce 1,5 % des couples sont en fait des couples composés de deux hommes ou de deux femmes cisgenres. Ces couples sont plus fréquents dans certains grands centres-villes, par exemple ceux de Toronto, de Vancouver, de Québec et de Montréal. 0,4 % des couples sont des couples où au moins une personne est transgenre ou non-binaire. Ces couples, au total, représentent un couple sur 250 dans la population générale. Ces couples sont également plus fréquents dans certains grands centres urbains du Canada, en particulier ceux de Victoria, de Halifax et de Fredericton. Alors voilà qui complète cette première partie sur les familles et les ménages canadiens. Je cède désormais la parole à mon collègue Tristan Cayn pour présenter les prochains résultats portant sur l'expérience militaire canadienne. Je vous remercie.
Oui, merci Laurent. Bonjour. Good morning. My name is Tristan Cayn. I'm a chief in the Census and Center Diversity and Sociocultural Statistics, Statistics Canada. With this release, Statistics Canada is proud to present the first census profile of Canada's military in half a century. The focus of this presentation is on women in the military, on the age and the location of those who serve. The details also talk about the military serving members and the veterans. In the spring of 2021, the census counted almost 98,000 currently serving members of the Canadian Armed Force, and more than 461,000 veterans were counted. The census brings significant value by offering insights on the demographic characteristics. For example, for the currently serving members and the veteran, the census can address data gap. Nos données du recensement nous informent sur les personnes transgenres et non-binaires, comme Laurent en parlait juste avant, ainsi que sur la diversité des sexes dans nos forces armées. La proportion de militaires transgenres est de 0,2%, ce qui est la même que la population totale. Et la proportion de militaires non-binaires est de 0,2% aussi, ce qui est plus élevé que la population totale. En termes d'âge, les membres des forces armées canadiennes sont plus jeunes que l'ensemble de la population active occupée. Par exemple, près de 35% des membres actuels étaient âgés entre 25 et 34 ans, comparativement à environ 22% pour la population active occupée. Et l'âge moyen des personnes en service était d'un peu plus de 36 ans, contre 42 ans pour l'ensemble de la population active occupée. Si on compare les sexes, les femmes étaient également légèrement plus âgées que leurs homologues masculins. Le recensement informe du lieu de résidence aussi, de ceux qui servent. Plus d'un tiers des militaires en service résident en Ontario et 1/5 résident au Québec. Ces deux provinces ont les plus grandes parts de militaires en service. Cependant, les provinces les plus petites sont surreprésentées par rapport à leur population globale. C'est le cas pour la Nouvelle-Écosse et le Nouveau-Brunswick. Au niveau métropolitain, Belleville et Kingston ont la plus grande part de militaires parmi la population totale, soit plus de 3% et plus de 2% respectivement. Ces villes sont suivies par Halifax, Fredericton et Saguenay. Toutes ces régions métropolitaines sont proches de bases militaires ou du collège militaire royal dans la situation de Kingston. Et cette proximité des bases militaires explique ainsi les plus grands nombres de militaires qui sont dans ces petites régions. And for the first time in 50 years, Statistics Canada has collected census data on veterans. The outcome of veterans have long constituted a data gap, and we must address it. The work is underway in collaboration with Veterans Affairs and the Department of National Defense. Almost 1/3 of the veterans in the census were between the age of 25 and 54 years old, and over 40% veterans were 65 and older. 1 in 6 veterans was a woman, less than the currently serving members. The share of veterans who identified as transgender or non-binary was similar to that of the population. This release already offers findings about living arrangements for veterans. Nearly 1/4 of veterans lived alone in 2021, especially women, and the share of living alone increased with age. And almost 4% of veterans reported living in a collective dwelling, and almost all of those dwellings were healthcare facilities. Detailed insights on veterans will come with further releases. In November, the data will provide veteran experience in the labor market after the years of services, and details could include social, cultural, economic, and family characteristics. Together, Statistics Canada, Veterans Affairs, and the National Department of Defense, along with their partners and stakeholders, are building a stronger data ecosystem. And the census and other data efforts will better inform the policies and the program that serve our military and our veteran population. This concludes my presentation. I would like to invite André Bernard pour la suite. Merci.
Merci beaucoup, Tristan. Donc, bonjour. Mon nom est André Bernard et je suis chef de l'analyse et du développement de données au Centre de la statistique du revenu et du bien-être socio-économique à Statistiques Canada. Today's release presents a comprehensive income portrait of the Canadian population based on data from the 2021 census. The census is uniquely positioned to assess the impacts of the pandemic on the incomes of Canadians. It tells us not only what happened in 2020, but also who might be more vulnerable to an economic shock. We will begin by looking at the employment income losses experienced by millions of Canadians during the first year of the pandemic. As we know, pandemic relief benefits were an important component of income in 2020. We will look at how income from government transfers, including federal emergency and recovery benefits, has helped offset lost employment income during the pandemic. We will also look at how the after-tax income of Canadian households have changed since the last census. As we will see, trends reflect the combined effects of employment income growth since the last census, which was slowed considerably by the pandemic, and higher government transfers, particularly in 2020. We will conclude by looking at how income inequality and the percentage of the population living in a low-income situation has evolved in Canada since the last census. It's important to note that all figures presented today are adjusted for inflation and expressed in 2020 constant dollars. In other words, variations in income that we are presenting represent real changes, net of the effects of inflation. Let's begin with employment income. For the majority of households, the most important source of income is employment income. It includes wages, salaries, and commissions from paid employment, as well as net self-employment income. In 2020, fewer Canadians received employment income, and median employment income fell compared with a year earlier. More specifically, 69.6% of Canadians aged 15 and older had employment income in 2020. This is down 0.4 points compared with 2019. The median employment income of Canadians was $37,200 in 2020. This is down 2.1% compared with 2019. The percentage receiving employment income and median employment income fell for women as well as for men during the pandemic. However, data from the census indicates a persistent gender employment income gap between women and men. So more specifically, just under 2/3 or 66.1% of Canadian women received employment income in 2020. For men, the share was 73.4%. The median employment income of women in 2020 was $32,000. Among men, the amount was $43,000. $43,200. So in other words, in 2020, men's median employment income remained over 1/3 higher than women's median employment income. So fewer Canadians received employment income and median employment income fell in 2020, but many received payments from government income support programs during the pandemic. These pandemic-related benefits help explain many of the trends that we are highlighting today. Pandemic-related benefits included new programs like the Canada Emergency Response Benefit, the Canada Recovery Benefit, and the Canada Emergency Student Benefit. They also included support within existing programs, such as the Canada Child Benefit, Old Age Security, and the Guaranteed Income Supplement. And they also included support from provincial and territorial governments. So in 2020, over 2/3 of Canadians aged 15 and older received payments from one or more of the pandemic relief programs. Over 1/4, or 27.6%, received federal emergency and recovery benefits. Among those who received these benefits, the median amount received for 2020 was $8,000, and this was similar for women and for men. Over half, or 55.9% of Canadian adults received top-ups to existing federal programs, but the amounts they received were lower compared with the federal emergency recovery benefits. Seniors were the most likely to receive these top-up payments, most often top-ups to the OAS and the GIS, and the median amount received was $500. Data from the census illustrate how pandemic-related benefits helped offset lost employment income in 2020. When employment-related benefits such as the CERB and employment insurance are added to employment income, we can see that there were fewer Canadians in lower income categories and more Canadians in higher income categories in 2020 compared with 2019. So for example, in 2020, There were close to 1.8 million fewer Canadians with employment income or employment-related benefits under $15,000, including close to 1 million fewer Canadians with no employment income or employment-related benefits. On the other end, also in 2020, there were 1.8 million more Canadians with employment income or employment-related benefits of $15,000 or more, including just over 250,000 more Canadians with employment income or employment-related benefits of $60,000 or more. So employment income is the main source of income for most households. However, many also receive government transfers, as we just saw. They received investment income and they pay income taxes. So here we will focus on household after-tax income. This combines income from all sources and subtracts taxes paid. After-tax income is seen to better represent the income Canadians have to support their consumption, investment, and saving needs. For Canada as a whole, in 2020, the median household after-tax income was $73,000. That's an increase of 9.8% compared with 2015. This is twice the pace of the previous intercensal period, so between 2010 and 2015, when the Canadian economy was rebounding from the 2008-2009 recession. This acceleration was driven by increases in government transfers like the Canada Child Benefit, as well as pandemic-related benefits. Growth in after-tax income was also faster for families with children. Looking now at provinces and territories, median household after-tax income rose in 8 provinces and in the 3 territories between 2015 and 2020. Alberta and Saskatchewan were the only 2 provinces recording declines during the period. Alberta and Newfoundland and Labrador were the only 2 provinces recording declines during the period. Saskatchewan recorded the smallest increase among the provinces. In these resource-rich provinces, record low oil prices in 2020 compounded the effects of pandemic restrictions. This is a reversal of trends highlighted in the 2016 census, in which what was highlighted then was that the 3 resource-rich provinces have led the country among provinces with the fastest growth rates among the provinces. Median after-tax income of households also increased in 8 of the 10 largest urban centres of Canada. Of those, only Edmonton and Calgary recorded declines since the last census. Calgary still leads the country among large urban centres, with a median after-tax income of $87,000, despite a $5,000 decline since the last census. Edmonton, with a $3,000 decline since the last census, now has the same median after-tax income as Ottawa-Gatineau, at $84,000. Both are slightly behind Toronto at $85,000. Le revenu médian après impôt des ménages de Montréal et de Québec était le même en 2020, soit de 65 500 $. Les 2 centres urbains ont enregistré des hausses de revenus depuis le dernier recensement, mais continuent d'afficher les 2 revenus médians après impôt les plus bas parmi les 10 plus grands centres urbains du Canada. Les données du recensement nous indiquent aussi que l'inégalité des revenus a baissé au Canada. Un des indicateurs qu'on utilise pour mesurer l'inégalité des revenus est le coefficient de Gini. Cet indicateur peut prendre une valeur entre 0 et 1. Plus la valeur est élevée, plus les inégalités sont grandes. Donc, selon cette mesure, la baisse de 2015 à 2020 est la plus grande de toute période de 5 ans depuis que l'on compile des données comparables sur le sujet, soit depuis 1976. L'inégalité des revenus a baissé dans toutes les provinces et tous les territoires, mais c'est en Alberta qu'on a enregistré la plus grande baisse. Les baisses d'inégalité des revenus dans les provinces et les territoires étaient en grande partie attribuables aux augmentations des transferts gouvernementaux. Ces augmentations des transferts ont surtout profité aux ménages dont le revenu était plus faible. Selon les données du recensement de 2021, l'inégalité des revenus était la plus élevée parmi les ménages du Nunavut, de l'Ontario, de l'Alberta et de la Colombie-Britannique. Elle était la plus faible parmi les ménages de l'île du Prince-Édouard, du Nouveau-Brunswick, du Yukon et du Québec. L'inégalité des revenus était aussi beaucoup plus grande dans certains grands centres urbains du Canada et plus petite dans les plus petits centres urbains et dans les régions rurales. Parmi les grands centres urbains, l'inégalité des revenus était la plus élevée à Toronto, à Calgary et à Vancouver. Elle était la plus basse à Saguenay, à Drummondville et à Québec. La baisse de l'inégalité des revenus a été accompagnée d'une baisse du pourcentage de Canadiens touchant un faible revenu. Une précision avant d'aller plus loin, la mesure du faible revenu qu'on utilise ici est basée sur le concept d'une personne dont le revenu ou d'une famille dont le revenu est faible comparativement à la médiane pour l'ensemble du Canada. C'est donc une mesure relative du faible revenu. Les données du recensement sur la mesure fondée sur un panier de consommation, qui est une autre mesure, qui est le seuil officiel de la pauvreté au Canada, vont être publiées au cours des prochains mois. Ce seuil de pauvreté repose sur le concept d'une personne ou d'une famille dont le revenu n'est pas suffisant pour acheter un panier de biens et services donnés. Donc, quant au taux de faible revenu, un peu plus d'un Canadien sur 10, soit 11,1 %, se trouvait dans une situation de faible revenu en 2020. C'est une baisse par rapport au taux de 14,4 % enregistré lors du recensement précédent. Malgré la baisse au niveau national, certains groupes demeurent plus susceptibles de vivre dans une situation de faible revenu, notamment les familles monoparentales et les personnes vivant seules. En effet, plus du quart ou 26,2 % des personnes vivant dans une famille monoparentale étaient dans une situation de faible revenu. Près du tiers ou 30,2 % des personnes vivant seules étaient dans une situation de faible revenu en 2020 également. Ce taux est près de 3 fois plus grand que la moyenne nationale. Il faut rappeler que les ménages composés d'une seule personne sont maintenant le type le plus courant de ménages au Canada, ayant dépassé pour la première fois en 2016 le nombre de ménages formés d'un couple avec des enfants. Parmi les provinces, le taux de faible revenu était le plus élevé à Terre-Neuve et Labrador, en Nouvelle-Écosse et au Nunavut. Il était le moins élevé dans les territoires du Nord-Ouest, au Yukon et en Alberta. Lorsqu'on examine les chiffres du faible revenu dans les grands centres urbains du Canada, on constate parfois des écarts considérables. Par exemple, à Trois-Rivières, le taux de faible revenu était de 14,3 %. C'est presque 2 fois plus élevé qu'à Oshawa, où le taux de faible revenu était de 7,3 %. Parmi les 3 grandes régions métropolitaines du pays, c'est à Montréal où le taux de faible revenu, à 12 % était le plus élevé. Le taux à Vancouver était le même que l'ensemble du Canada, à 11,1 %, et à Toronto, le taux de faible revenu était de 10,2 %. Ceci complète notre tour d'horizon des faits saillants de la diffusion d'aujourd'hui sur la situation du revenu au Canada, tiré des données du recensement de 2021. En terminant, j'aimerais vous rappeler qu'il s'agit aujourd'hui donc de la 3e diffusion des résultats du recensement de 2021. 4 autres diffusions auront lieu au cours de l'année en 2022. La prochaine sera le 17 août et présentera les données sur les langues. Comme mentionné en début de présentation, on invite la population à consulter les données de leur recensement sur le site web de Statistique Canada et de rester à l'affût pour les prochaines diffusions du recensement à venir au cours des prochains mois. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup à tous les trois. On va passer à la période de questions. Alors, vous pouvez utiliser, pour tous les journalistes, là, vous pouvez utiliser la fonction main levée si vous souhaitez poser une question. Un rappel qu'on va alterner entre l'anglais et le français, que la priorité sera donnée aux membres de la tribune. So please use the raise hand function if you wish to ask a question, and we're alternating between English and French, just as a reminder, with priority given to the press gallery members. Parfait. Donc, juste pendant que ça se fait, je voulais juste dire un gentil rappel à tous les journalistes et à toutes les personnes sur l'appel, donc d'utiliser un microphone approprié, sinon les interprètes se réservent le droit de ne pas traduire. Donc, on va commencer avec Pascal Vachon de TFO.
Oui, bonjour. Merci de prendre les questions ce matin. Moi, je voulais juste savoir, considérant l'inflation, les prix des logements, le prix du pétrole qui augmente beaucoup là, cette année, on l'a vu, est-ce que le portrait pourrait être... est-ce que les chiffres que vous avez recueillis du dernier recensement pourraient déjà être un peu, c'est moi l'expression, mais post-datés, un peu en retard ou ils pourraient être très différents aujourd'hui?
Merci, M. Vachon, pour votre question. Le portrait du recensement de 2021 nous donne probablement un aperçu de ce qui s'est passé, donne un tour d'horizon complet de ce qui s'est passé en 2020 dans le cas de la situation du revenu et en 2021. Mais c'est des données qui sont encore pertinentes aujourd'hui parce qu'ils peuvent nous permettre, par exemple, d'identifier les groupes qui pourraient être plus vulnérables à des hausses de prix, par exemple. Donc, je parlais tout à l'heure du taux de faible revenu. Donc, ça, c'est un exemple. Donc, si on identifie des groupes qui sont davantage à faible revenu, donc ça, c'est des groupes, on sait, lorsqu'il y a des hausses d'inflation, pour être davantage vulnérables. Je rappellerai en même temps qu'on a, en plus du recensement qui donne ce portrait complet détaillé chaque 5 ans, on a des données mensuelles à Statistique Canada sur les salaires horaires, sur les chiffres d'inflation, justement, dont vous parliez, sur l'emploi. Et puis, on va suivre, Statistique Canada va continuer de suivre comment ces hausses d'inflation, puis comment ça se répercute sur la situation du revenu des Canadiens. On va avoir des données sur le revenu de 2021 l'an prochain déjà avec des données d'enquête. Donc, ça va être très intéressant à suivre. Statistique Canada va continuer de suivre ces tendances.
Merci. Et en sous-question, pouvez-vous m'expliquer un peu, sans les aides de la COVID, là, la PCU, toutes les aides qui ont été apportées par les gouvernements et les gouvernements, quel aurait été l'impact? Parce que vous le dites vous-même, le revenu par ménage a augmenté après les impôts, mais le revenu de l'emploi a baissé. Sans ces aides-là, pouvez-vous me décrire, ça aurait été quoi l'impact si les gens n'auraient pas reçu cet argent-là?
C'est une bonne question, c'est une question intéressante. C'est très difficile de dire qu'est-ce qui serait arrivé sans les aides, ou de retirer un événement majeur comme soit les restrictions liées à la pandémie ou les transferts. Donc, je ne peux pas répondre directement à votre question. Tout ce qu'on peut voir, c'est la situation du revenu d'emploi comparé 2019 à 2020. Puis de faire cette même comparaison lorsqu'on tient compte des transferts qui ont eu lieu en 2020, mais aussi 2019, donc en prenant en compte les choses comme l'assurance-emploi. Puis comme je mentionnais dans la présentation, ce qu'on voit lorsqu'on fait cette comparaison-là, c'est qu'en ajoutant les transferts, il y a davantage de Canadiens, même dans les catégories de revenus plus élevés, et moins de Canadiens dans les catégories de revenus moins élevés. Puis lorsqu'on fait juste regarder le revenu d'emploi, on voit plus de Canadiens en 2020 dans les catégories de revenus les moins élevés. Donc, c'est à l'aide de ces données-là qu'on peut répondre, mais on ne peut pas malheureusement répondre directement à la question qu'est-ce qui serait arrivé sans les aides? Ça nécessiterait des analyses plus poussées.
Marie-Danielle Smith, The Canadian Press.
Good morning. Thank you. First question, I'm wondering if you can tell us whether the military component of the census, is this a one-time thing, or will that measurement be repeated in the following census as well?
I believe that's a question for you, Mr. Cayn.
Tristan, je pense que la question s'adressait à toi.
OK, excusez-moi. Can you just repeat the question? My sound is not very good. If you can speak more slowly, if you don't mind.
Sure, no problem. Hopefully you can hear me. I was wondering if the military figures that you collected this year, is that sort of a single snapshot, or will that same collection be repeated in future censuses?
Okay, thank you for your question. Yes, it is for now a single snapshot. What's happening is that we don't know exactly what will be collected in 2026, the next census. And also this question is not really comparable to the last one that was asked in 1971. So for now, we are giving a first portrait. And if next time we have another measure, we will probably have a second comparison base. Thank you.
Thanks. And just another question on income. What are the factors that led to the decline of household income in Calgary and Edmonton specifically, if you're able to get into that level of detail? Thanks.
Question. So the analysis we present today didn't go into the details. We need to unpack in details what are the factors. But what we can say generally is that the trends in resource will be impacted by the price of oil. So in 2020, if you remember in the spring, oil prices were at record lows. And even during the period in between the two censuses, so between 2015 and 2020, prices were much lower than in the previous 5-year period. So that tends to have kind of far-reaching effects on the economies of these provinces, so not just the resource sector. So that helped explain some of the trends we are seeing today.
Now we're going with Oliver Moore, Globe and Mail.
Good morning, thanks. I want to ask about as well about household makeup. To what extent are the changes we're seeing in household makeup because Canada doesn't have the kind of housing stock it needs given the current real estate prices and the current population and demographics?
Thank you for your question. Yeah, this is an interesting one. There's obviously lots of discussions and papers out there on the housing crisis in Canada. The release today is focusing, on the household types, living alone, one-person households comprised of census families, of roommates. Obviously, there are trends that will affect or that will have an impact on the housing market. The fact, for example, and I'm thinking the first one that comes to mind is the trend that is related to one-person households. It is increasing. It's been increasing since a while now, and in 2016 it became the most prevalent type of households in Canada. It's continuing. The 2021 census data shows that now it's about 3 out of 10 households that are one-person households, and obviously that's having an impact, on the demand for dwellings. So that's the first thing. It's of course also related to the aging of the population, and Statistics Canada released last April a lot of data on the age structure of the population. Obviously, population aging will continue over the coming year. It will continue to even accelerate as the baby boomers are now shifting age 65 and older. So these trends, these demographic trends have certainly impacts on the demand for dwellings in this country. It's not the only ones. Demographic factors are not the only ones, but it's two that comes really quickly to our mind. And yes, some of the data that we're releasing today are certainly related to that.
Thanks. And the other question is about roommate households. The release talked about some of the student cities, Halifax, Windsor, Kingston, places like that. But obviously, those have been student cities for decades and decades, centuries in some cases. So what other factors are at play when we look at broadly the rise in roommate households? Is it largely affordability, or is there more than that?
Good question. We've already seen, I think it was between the census 2006 and 2011, roommates households were our fastest growing households as well. So it's not the first time that we are seeing a strong increase in households comprised of roommates. Very often it is actually a strategy to cope with housing affordability, certainly. And we are seeing shifts in ways young adults are living. Another good example is the fact that fewer of them are living as part of couples. If you go back in the 1960s, most of these young adults were living as part of couples. They were establishing their own families much earlier in their lives than right now. So, I mean, there's been a diversification of the types of households in which we're finding those young adults. And yeah, there's many reasons for that. Cultural preferences, for sure, longer studies, sometimes just individual preferences. But yeah, roommates, especially when we're seeing that these roommates households are growing fast in some of the large urban centers, we could certainly think that it is a strategy to cope with housing affordability and also the cost of living.
Stephen D'Souza, CBC.
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Monsieur Bernard, I was just wondering if you could repeat your first answer in English, just on the fact that with the current state of inflation, prices going up from everything from food to gas, how that affects how we look at these numbers as a snapshot just of 2020.
So yeah, for sure. Thank you. So the data we are presenting today presents a comprehensive portrait of the income situation in 2020. Since then, many things have changed, including we've had increased inflation in recent months. So first of all, I would say that the data we are presenting today can be very relevant to the situation today. For example, we can identify with detail today communities or groups that are more vulnerable to be in low income, for example, so to be more likely to be in low income, and who would be more likely to be more vulnerable to increased inflation. In addition to that, so that's we have the census that paints this comprehensive portrait once every 5 years. And in addition to that, obviously we have regular surveys, we have regular statistical programs, many of which provide very timely data. So for example, we have obviously the data from the consumer price index, but also monthly data, very timely monthly data on wages. So we can track that situation, the situation of income that way. And next year we'll have the full data for the income in 2021. So we'll be able to keep tracking kind of how the situation regarding inflation is reflected in the incomes of Canadians over time.
Excellent. And just, you were just saying that we can see what communities are more vulnerable to high inflation. Based on what you see in the 2020 statistics, what communities would you say are more vulnerable to inflation?
So that's kind of an interpretation that others could do. So depending on the proportion, living with low income would be one factor that people would want to look at. There might be others. But we know, for example, that smaller urban centers, many of the smaller urban centers have lower and higher proportions living with low income. We know that some provinces, Newfoundland and Labrador, for example, had higher proportions living with low income. So these are some of the examples. And obviously, in terms of household types, lone parents, so people living in one-parent families, as well as people living alone, are much more likely to live in a low-income situation. So these are examples of groups who would be more vulnerable to an economic shock.
Merci beaucoup. Il nous reste encore quelques minutes. Si vous avez des questions, we still have a few minutes if you still have questions. So please don't hesitate to use the raised hand function on Zoom. Okay, Mr. Moore, you had another question?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great, thanks. I want to follow up the question, Mr. Martel. It's sort of really the same question I asked the first time, but from the other side of it. It's not the effects of these demographics on housing prices and the real estate market, but really, to what extent are we seeing these demographic shifts in how people are living because there is not the housing stock available to them, because there are so many single-family homes and so on? Are people sharing homes because there's not a suitable home for them to buy, for example, would be one way to look at this as a layman. Is that what we're seeing here, that people are reacting in their living accommodations to the fact that there isn't the right kind of housing for them?
Good question. Hard to tell. I would say it could be both. It could be a reaction and also sometimes cultural preferences. I'm thinking, for example, of the fact that we are seeing large increases in multi-generational households as well. A part of the explanation might be, related to some subgroups of the population who have cultural preferences for that type of living arrangements. We know that we have in Canada a sustained immigration rate when we compare to other countries of the world. The immigration plan released last February showed that Canada is targeting to receive more immigrants annually in the coming 3 years. That could be also part of the explanation why we are seeing this increasing diversity of the different living arrangements of Canadians. Some subgroups of the population might have cultural preferences for households in which there are multiple census families, in a household where there's also people living with their grandparents, children living with their grandparents, with or without their own parents as well. So that's something that we are monitoring, and we've seen fairly significant increases over the last 20 years. So I think it's all part of the explanation here.
And would you expect, if we see sort of the kind of housing building that CMHC is calling for, and the federal government is calling for, would you expect to see some of these living arrangements then smooth out, the people who are sharing for reasons, not the cultural reasons you just mentioned, but for the economic reasons, that we would see less of that as a result?
Could be. I mean, one thing that was interesting to see in the 2021 census is about, young adults living with their parents. We've seen for 3 or 4 censuses fairly significant increases in the number of young adults living with their parents. Obviously, it was probably in some of the large cities across this country a strategy to cope with high cost of living. Between 2016 and 2021, it was we've observed a leveling off. Interesting, and maybe it's due to partly to the pandemic. We know that some of these large cities, we've seen the population moving out of these large cities, such as in Montreal and Toronto, and to establish themselves to more rural regions. Telework was part of the explanation why we were observing these migration shifts, people exiting large urban centers. So that might be an explanation of why we've seen young adults living with their parent, the share leveling off between 2016 and 2021. So that's an example of how the context could explain some of the shifts that we're seeing in the types of households that Canadians are living in. Who knows what the future will look like, but certainly Statistics Canada will continue to monitor these trends very closely to show the increasing diversity of families and households.
And last question will go to Dylan Robertson from the Winnipeg Free Press.
Hi there. A question for Mr. Martel, just building on Bill's questions here. You mentioned household composure and Indigenous people and some racialized groups having larger households. I'm just wondering if there's any way to tell if the inverse is happening from the data today, that non-racialized households are seeing more multi-generational, because that might speak to that economic trend. I'm just not sure if you have the data today that can kind of, from which we could draw that kind of conclusion.
It's a very interesting question. Actually, today is our last release from the short form questionnaire of the census. So we don't have all the questions that were asked to Canadians in the 2021 census. We're going to have releases in September, October, and November using the long form questionnaire, where we have much richer data about, these subgroups of the population: Indigenous people belonging to visible minority groups. We have ethnic origins. We have all sorts of different questions reflecting, the ethnocultural composition of the population. And there are further analyses that are planned to go exactly in the type of direction that you're seeing. So with these data, with the full richness of the census, we're going to be able to go deeper in the analysis and show, for example, to what extent some types of households are more frequent among some particular group of the population. And Statistics Canada will look into that. I would say stay tuned. We don't have yet the answer, because the data from the 2021 census has not been released yet for Indigenous groups, for people belonging to visible minority groups or racialized groups. So that will come in a few months from now.
And just as a follow-up, looking at the after-tax income, I'm just wondering if someone can speak generally to this situation for the oil-producing provinces, to have not have this growth in Alberta and Newfoundland and Labrador, and yet talking about the government subsidies here. I mean, can you kind of draw a conclusion about what it would have looked like for the energy-producing provinces if we didn't have these COVID subsidies?
That's a very interesting question. Unfortunately, with the data we have, we can't make that sort of analysis. We can't draw these conclusions with the data we have today. So what would have happened absent these transfers is difficult to assess. What we do know, however, as I've mentioned previously, is that we can look at the situation of employment income without transfers and how it's evolved. And then what's happened once we add employment income plus transfers. We know that for all provinces, as you've mentioned, if you compare after-tax income from since the last census to the data we are releasing today, there are increases in all provinces except in Alberta, in Newfoundland and Labrador. So that speaks to, okay, there was more to than just the pandemic restrictions for these provinces. They were obviously impacted by the lower price for resources. So, but we unfortunately cannot assess what would have happened without these transfers.
Merci beaucoup. Donc, c'est tout le temps qu'on a pour les questions. Merci encore pour votre participation aujourd'hui. Puis, je vous souhaite une très belle journée. So this ends the press conference today. Thank you very much to all the participants and wishing you a lovely day. Au revoir.